This program is brought to you by Stanford University.
Well, thanks for having me today. It's a pleasure to come and speak to you a bit about what's going on in the global coal market. We're underway on a major research project in that area at the Program on Energy and Sustainable Development, and you'll hear a little bit about that project today. The focus will primarily be on sort of long-term trends, what's likely to impact the fuel mix going forward, and there'll certainly be an emphasis, I think, on the interaction between carbon and coal, and to some extent how carbon policy is affecting how coal dispatches in the marketplace and how people think about investing in different energy technologies. Obviously, this has a huge impact on emissions from energy, and we'll drill down on that a little bit, and also try and give you a sort of look into what some of the major trends are in the coal market and how things function in the coal market. So we'll start out with a bit of background, just so everybody's on the same page. And I think the politics are getting pretty hot lately. So you probably haven't been reading the paper if you're not aware of some of these issues. James Hansen is NASA's climate scientist, famous for bringing climate change to the attention of the U.S. Congress. And the rhetoric coming from James is pretty stark, and you see that there. So we're starting to see coal being sort of treated as the enemy of civilization. Barack Obama got caught saying to the San Francisco Chronicle during the campaign that he was going to bankrupt coal. It wasn't quite Bittergate, but it did stir up a bit of controversy that you may remember. And then our current Energy Secretary, Steve Chu, formerly of Stanford, of course, is well known for saying that coal is his worst nightmare. I think once you sit down before Congress, you start saying things like, coal is an important domestic resource. So if you pay attention to the politics, you start to think that coal is on its last legs and it's the end of the coal era. The numbers and the forecasts from the experts that look at energy markets start to tell a different story. Pretty much for the last, or the better part of this decade, coal has been the fastest growing fossil fuel source in the world, faster than oil, gas, renewables, and sort of all the below, as you can see here. So in many ways, what we're potentially looking at is quite the opposite of what the politics suggest in the U.S. and the rapid acceleration of coal around the world, or coal use, mostly driven by coal-fired electricity generation. I think it's important to start out by acknowledging where that's taking place. Most of the growth in coal demand is happening in the non-OECD countries. And to sort of say it in layman's terms, it's mostly Asia. I think people expect growth in coal consumption in Europe and America to be more or less flat, while the growth trajectories in the East are fairly staggering. So if we have a tension between this sort of rhetoric around the end of coal and the coal renaissance, why do we care about that? I think for this audience, many of you are familiar with the implications in terms of emissions and climate. In terms of emissions from energy and from fossil fuels, coal is the largest culprit, you could say. Here we have in the developed world the sort of emissions trajectory as forecasted by the IEA out to 2030 from fossil fuels. As you can see, coal accounts for a significant part of that, and there is some growth, but it doesn't really compare to that part of the graph. And so I think we'll keep that in mind as we go through what's going on in the coal markets. At the Program on Energy and Sustainable Development, we're looking at regional and global coal markets around the world, but if we're focusing on emissions, and we will somewhat today, it's important to keep in mind that the orange part of the graph that you see here is the bulk of the source, the sort of largest source of incremental emissions going forward. So for those of you interested in the climate problem, obviously coal is a very important piece of that puzzle. So just to drill down a little bit so you can see where this growth is coming from when we think about that orange bar and sort of why we're seeing that type of growth, I think we can attribute that growth to two pretty simple factors. Coal is cheap. It's in fact very cheap. And it's available domestically. So you have a confluence of these two factors, mostly that it's very cheap and that these regions are developing very quickly, and coal is a great way to do that. I think you could almost say coal is the backbone of development in a lot of the developing world right now. It also is appealing in terms of energy security. There's no cartel, there's no OPEC. You don't have the same risks around gas supply out of the Middle East, and the reserves are pretty well distributed. And in often cases, they're inside these countries. So it's very appealing for those reasons. So just to point out where that logic is really taking hold, we can start with India. And what you see here are it's an aggregation of government plans for capacity additions for coal-fired power. The dates are vary depending on the extent of the plans from the various governments. In India, we're looking at a massive build-out of coal-fired power. Pretty substantial numbers coming out of Pakistan, all the way down the curve to Vietnam, which is currently an exporter, mainly to China. That's expected to flip. We're going to see Vietnam plan its development around coal-fired power as well. And of course, the juggernaut towards the bottom of the list here is China. That's a story I think most of you are familiar with. And it's hard to talk about coal or emissions without talking about China, so we'll try and touch on that a little bit as much as we have time. Just to give you an idea of those numbers, the total planning for coal capacity right now is about 579 gigawatts. Total installed capacity in China is about 792. So that's a lot of coal. And what that translates into in terms of global trade, if we got about 20% of those plans realized, that'd be about 400 million tons. The global trade in thermal coal, or coal for electricity generation, is currently about 700 million tons. So even a fraction of these, if they come to fruition, are substantial in terms of the coal market, in terms of emissions, in terms of how energy demand develops around the world. Just to give you a bit of background, and we won't go into too much detail on what we do at the Program on Energy and Sustainable Development, we are working on a long-term study on the global coal market. There's two parts to that. One is a quantitative model being built by some colleagues of ours in Berlin that looks at the global trade flows. And a lot of what goes into that model is qualitative and comes from a series of political economy case studies that are looking at major political and institutional issues around the world in the major coal producing and consuming countries that are going to affect how the global coal trade and coal demand develops in the next few decades. So I'll give you, we might be stuck here. There we go. So just to give you an idea of what this trade looks like, and when we talk about a global coal market, and we talk about the trends in the global coal market and this massive growth, what are some of the metrics and what are some of the things that we look at? Just to give you a quick snapshot of reserves globally, I said they're widely distributed. That's true. And no one is really concerned about peak coal in the way that they're concerned about peak oil. I think for the purposes certainly of our study and generally for many of you in the room, reserves are not a real constraint on coal demand or coal usage. Russia has a lot of coal. The U.S. has the most coal. China's got plenty. There's a lot in Australia and India and Africa, mostly in South Africa, and so on. So thinking about the way that this trade is developed, just to give you some context, we want to distinguish between two types of coal, really. First is called steam coal, often referred to as thermal coal, and that's the coal used for making electricity. As you can see, that's accounted for the vast majority of growth in the global coal market in the past few decades. Coking coals are used in the process to make steel. They're generally of higher quality. They're also more expensive. For the purposes of our talk, they're a smaller part of the market, and I think we'll focus on steam coal. So if we have this staggering growth, what this image does is give you a picture of what the market looks like today. And when we talk about global trade flows and where this coal is coming from and where it's going, I think this is a helpful visualization. As I said, the steam coal trade is currently about 700 million tons a year. If you add the met coal or the metallurgical coal trade, coking coal, it's probably closer to 900. This shows where the major sources and demand for coal is in the seaborne or globally traded coal market. Just to point out a few key countries, China obviously has huge domestic production and consumption. They're only putting about 45 million tons into the market a year. In terms of comparison to what they're doing inside of China, that's quite small, but it ends up being significant in terms of how prices and trade flows occur in the global coal market. Australia is the largest exporter of coal. They make a lot of money selling that throughout Asia and to some extent into Europe. Indonesia is the largest exporter of steam coal, specifically for electric generation. India, as I mentioned, is expected to have a huge increase in demand in the coming years. South Africa also imports exports quite a bit of coal. And if you'll notice their geography, it's important to note their position here. That's because you can segment the coal market roughly into two parts. That's what we call the Atlantic Basin in this part of the map. And the economics of trade in the Atlantic Basin are primarily driven by European demand for coal. Most of that coal traditionally has come from South Africa, increasingly Colombia, and to a small extent, depending on the economics of freight and other things, it comes from Asia. But as we see trends like Indian demand for coal really taking off, this positioning becomes really important because it plays a key role in connecting the basins. The second basin being the Pacific Basin, which is really now driving the global coal trade, as I sort of mentioned with regard to electricity demand in Asia. And that'll become increasingly important when we think about how the market's going to behave in the future. When we start to think about coal prices and coal markets, the traditional view is that we have a lot of regionally distinct and disparate markets around the world that are isolated, much the way that natural gas was 10 to 20 years ago. That is less and less the case as many of these markets are connecting for a number of reasons. Price formation and trade is increasingly happening in tandem. Here you see the European price over the last few years and the major spike that happened with the spike in most energy commodities. Richards Bay is South Africa. That's one of the main sources of coal into Europe, and that price more or less tracks the European price. Newcastle is the major benchmark in Asia. If you're looking at Asian prices, the Australians are the biggest exporters, and that's where you look. Traditionally, most of their coal has gone to Japan, but they're selling at a lot of other places now as well. As you can see, the pricing in the two markets moves, for the biggest extent, sort of in tandem. The outlier here, to a certain degree, is Central Appalachia, that being the east coast of the United States. And you'll notice a difference here in the first part of the graph where the black line is actually above a lot of these other prices and even at times the European price. In these conditions, U.S. coals are not going to leave the U.S., and we can pretty much consider the U.S. to be a self-contained market. What happened in the last year and a half or so is European prices got quite a bit above U.S. prices, and that started pulling U.S. coals offshore and affecting domestic prices internally in the U.S. And that, I think, is a good cue into another trend that we're seeing when we talk about the globalization of the coal market is these sort of global benchmarks are starting to have real impact on price formation and coal markets inside of the major coal producing and consuming countries. And just to highlight an example in Asia, which I think is becoming quite important, is the relationship of the Newcastle price, which is the major indicator in Australia, to the Qinghuangdao price, which is the coal export and import port in northern China that moves the most coal. As you can see, they're not sort of 100% correlated, and they don't always move together. But what happens is the Chinese market is now increasingly having to respond to the international market and pressures that those prices could put on domestic demand. So I want to pivot sort of from the fundamentals and move towards climate. I think we can split that out essentially in terms of where it really matters for coal into east and west. So I'll say a bit about what's going on in Europe, and I think that tells us a lot about how we should think about what's going to happen in the U.S. as we sort of anticipate carbon legislation here. I'll say a bit about China. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of time, and the Chinese market is incredibly complicated, so we'll just touch on a few trends and then move on to a few options for mitigation or how we ought to think about mitigating all of the CO2 that we're going to see come out of the coal market in the coming decades. What I want to show you here is how power markets make decisions about which fuels they use. This is very important in the short term because it ends up deciding, do you use coal, do you use gas? How do you answer the energy demand in a certain power grid or in a certain area by making real choices about technology and fuel? And then what I'll show you is how carbon starts to change that. And I think that's very important in Europe right now, and it will become important in the United States. And I think is really useful when you start to think about how carbon, and particularly cap and trade, changes the economics and the behavior in these energy markets. So let's look at a case without carbon in Germany, which is Europe's most liquid power market. What you see here is the spark spread, which is the margin that a power generator or a utility makes by selling natural gas-fired power into the market. So you take the price of wholesale power and you subtract the main cost input, which is fuel, adjusted for efficiency. What you see is they're making money. That's not a problem. The volatility here is mainly due to the volatility in gas price. Let's throw coal on there. You make more money burning coal. It's that simple, and that's why we see a lot of coal in the power markets around the world. If you're a generator and you're looking at this graph, pretty clear what you do, you burn coal. Why is that important, and why do we need to think about the switching point between coal and gas? Because in the near term, that represents one of the huge opportunities for emissions mitigation. I'm obviously not advocating any fuel, but the fact is gas has about half the emissions intensity of coal when you burn it. So just to show you that in sort of an aggregated form, where you see this line come above zero is where gas becomes more profitable than coal, and you would choose gas over coal, of course resulting in less emissions. And as you can see, coal pretty much dominates that equation. So let's factor carbon in. Now you have what you call the clean spark spread, which means you tack carbon on the end. You subtract out carbon as an additional cost from the revenue you're going to make, which is the wholesale power price. Because gas is less carbon intensive, it's less exposed to the carbon price. So what happens is when we do the same thing with coal, you see these spreads tighten up. That means that carbon starts to increase the degree to which gas or lower carbon intensive fuels, we can think of it that way, as gas is a proxy for lower carbon options, starts to really increase. And just to take a look at the difference between the two cases, with and without carbon, and how utilities and power markets are going to dispatch power, look at here versus here as the cases when the cleaner fuels get dispatched in the European power market. Oh, getting a little ahead. And what I want to point out is carbon is not automatically switching power markets and economies to lower carbon intensive fuels. It is starting to make that shift, but where you really see it happen is only in conditions where you have a certain confluence of events. What happened here is you had a very high coal price relative to gas in combination with a very high carbon price. That combination started to switch power markets towards cleaner burning options. So let's think about what's going to happen in Europe going forward and how we can think about what carbon does to fuel choice and emissions in these markets in a cap and trade system. What you see here is the price of carbon in the EU market. Now, obviously, it's quite volatile, and from the perspective of long-term planning, this is something you have to take into consideration if you're thinking about huge investments on the order of $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion for a coal plant. These types of revenues are critical to whether you make money or you don't, and whether these projects go ahead. So if you're building coal, you've got quite a bit of exposure relative to competing fuels to this type of volatility. But the bigger point is there's a reason that you see 4 lines here and it stops in 2012. If you're making long-term decisions, which eventually all decisions about power generation and investment are long-term decisions on the scale of 50 years, the real problem is you don't know what happens after 2012. So even if you could really tolerate 10 euro carbon, which maybe you can right now, in fact, as we saw in the last graph, you probably can still make money. You don't know if we're talking about 30, 50, 80, or 90 euros after 2012. Why is that? We don't know what the EU is going to do to some degree, and we don't know what Kyoto is going to do. And I'm not going to go into all the details about the moving parts there, but there are quite a few that affect the economics. And so what you have is not a price signal. It's not 10 euros saying to these sort of coal companies and utilities, don't build this coal plant. It's the huge risk factor around not knowing what the market looks like and not being able to lock in these economics around these long-term investments. And I think keeping in mind that type of policy risk and what that does to decisions in energy markets relative to price signals is something that will be useful as we go through the talk. Moving on to the US, I think we can take the European case as a precedent if we believe that the US is moving towards cap and trade. I do. Whether or not we prefer it against a tax, I'm not going to discuss here because I think the political reality is, and Obama obviously sort of substantiated this in his latest budget, we're moving towards cap and trade. And really what we can do is look at the EU ETS and the European system and decide what that means for what's coming in the US. So what do we know about cap and trade other than that it's on the way? Not much. Why does this matter? Because it matters in the next 10, 5, and so on years, what gets built in the United States? We've got about 50% coal capacity right now. In the last 10 years, most of the capacity additions, which of course will create long-term demand for various fuels, tended towards natural gas. Coal obviously is economical, but this starts to really enter a huge degree of uncertainty into what the long-term demand for various fuels is going to look like. What you have here is the futures market, I call it that loosely, for delivery of carbon under non-existent cap and trade. What that means is there is a market for delivery of a carbon credit under a cap and trade policy that doesn't exist. Okay? What that tells you is this risk is very real, and people who are in the energy market building plants and buying fuel are trying to get their heads around these economics so that they can go ahead and build plants or not build plants, which has been very difficult lately. And I would suggest to you, if you look at sort of the volumes here, that this is not really a meaningful market. But the demand is clearly there for some certainty around what's going to happen because the uncertainty is really paralyzing the utility industry in this country. I put Obama's budget numbers up there from last week because I think they're interesting. What I find interesting is these numbers are roughly aligned in terms of where we think on January 1, 2013, this carbon price is going to be that we don't know about yet. We don't know what this policy regime looks like. Obama's betting it's going to be about $14. There's going to be a lot of things that are going to affect whether or not that comes into reality. But I think these are sort of the best indications we can get at the moment of where the U.S. carbon market might start. What does that really mean? What does $14 mean in terms of long-term coal demand in the U.S.? Do we stay at 55 or 50% coal? Do we go to 55? Do we go to 60? Or do we just stop building coal altogether? What I want to suggest is, again, let's look at the issues around fuel competition and what those mean for what gets built and what gets generated. What you see here is a recent study that PJM did, which is a major grid on the East Coast. They did a lot of modeling work on their own grid, so not in a sort of top-down macroeconomic way and said the benefits of carbon price on the economy will be this or that. They looked at a specific grid and they said this is what's going to dispatch under certain carbon conditions versus other carbon conditions, taking into account the major variables that you need to look at. And those are mainly, again, the coal price, the gas price as the nearest alternative, and the carbon price. So what we see is at coal prices around $2.30 an MMBTU, which is not far off from the delivered coal price right now, and a gas price of $6.44, which is admittedly above where we are right now, about $4, you need a $35 carbon price to move towards less carbon-intensive fuels. What does that mean? If I'm burning coal, I'm not that scared by cap and trade right now. I'm not that scared by the price, but I'm probably pretty scared around the policy uncertainty because I have a 10, 20, 30-year view. But in the short term, I'm going to be burning coal. Now, let's look at the leverage that just a movement in the gas price has on how much coal you use. I would suggest to you, in the near term, this is a much bigger deal than whatever carbon price DC comes up with. Gas is a volatile commodity. The move from $6 to $10 means that if coal stays the same price, all of a sudden you've got to have a $76 carbon price to move towards a less carbon-intensive fuel. Again, that's pretty bullish for coal. And, one thing I think to think about is if we're looking at $14 out of the Obama budget, believe it or don't believe it, but I think what we all know is the votes in Congress, when they line up, are probably not going to be there for a $30, $40, $50, $60, $70, $80 carbon price when we start this thing out. So I don't think coal is quite shaking in its boots because of this. The other thing that we really need to watch in the U.S. as we look forward to the long term is what's going to happen with the allocation of these carbon permits when we get cap and trade. All these companies that are emitting, they're asking for 100% free permits. That's more or less what happened at the beginning of the European scheme. What does that mean? Again, they can keep burning coal and making money. Obama wants to auction it all, but again, I don't think the votes in Congress are going to be there, and we should expect these price signals not to tell the whole story when a lot of people burning these fuels are getting free permits. They're not completely exposed to these prices. The last point I want to make about the U.S. is again about what role these price signals are really going to play in changing behavior in the U.S. electricity market and in the market for fuels in the U.S. versus regulation. There's a lot to say about what's been going on here. I'm going to keep it brief. We can talk about it in greater detail after the talk. But regulation, arguably, coming out of the EPA and places like that, has been much more important in the last few years and been doing much more of the heavy lifting around what gets built and what doesn't than the anticipation of the carbon price. Why is that? There's a lot of uncertainty around the permitting process for building carbon-intensive plants. There's a big debate right now about applying clean air standards to CO2, and that's essentially what Mass versus EPA is about. We know that the Supreme Court said you could do it, but we don't know how the EPA is actually going to do it. Therefore, we don't know what kind of cost that translates into, and what that's done is thrown the coal industry, or really the utility business, or the part of the utility business that builds coal plants, into a paralysis. They don't know if they're going to be able to get the permit, or they don't know if when they go to the EPA to get the permit for their coal plant, the EPA is going to say, well, you've got to install the best available control technology for CO2. I don't know what that is. The market doesn't know what that is, and no one knows what it costs. So all of a sudden, the coal plant that you had, and it was nice and the economics worked and you didn't really care about the carbon price, you were still making money, is a big question mark. Actually, I'll just make one more point about the U.S. I think we need to change, particularly watching groups like the Sierra Club, how we think about the role the environmental movement within the U.S. is playing in these markets. A lot of the guys who are trying to stop coal and who are making it really the primary focus of their group, like the Sierra Club, are becoming really sophisticated, and it's making a big difference. And they are not the people chaining themselves to trucks and hiring balloons and putting on a stage show. Sure, that's going on, but the Sierra Club is tracking every single coal plant in every stage of development in the United States, and it plans to litigate on every one that it can. And I've talked to them, and they don't need to win. They don't need to win the court decision. All they need to do is add cost to a degree that that plant no longer makes sense versus competing fuels. These guys are sophisticated. They are regularly blocking real projects in the real world, and I expect that to continue. They're going to continue to leverage indecision around the regulatory questions in their favor. And again, they don't have to win. They just have to create uncertainty enough that cost blows up these projects. We'll move on to China. We don't have a whole lot of time. I think this is an important slide to put up. Many of you know this fact. The Chinese economy is essentially based on coal when we talk about energy. 70% of primary energy consumption comes from coal. And if you look at the percentage of electricity generation, it's even higher. Poland's got them beat, but it's a much smaller country. Now, why do we care? Well, we certainly care in terms of emissions. And China's producing about 2.8 billion tons of coal a year. Most of that they're using themselves. But that ends up having a pretty big impact on what happens in the international market. And if we're thinking about mitigation of CO2, this is really something that's probably one of the biggest targets in the world. How do you get the Chinese to stop emitting based around these economics and these coal-fired power plants? I think you've got to start by understanding the leverage points in the Chinese system. And that, of course, is an argument for understanding the coal market around the world. But particularly with regard to China, I want to show you something in terms of how the market behaves in response to a completely uneven state of reform going in or occurring within the Chinese system. And this is the type of issue we spend a lot of time looking at in the program on energy and sustainable development. Two things you've got to understand right off the bat. Start here. The top line is the retail power price, right? If you're a power generator, that's what you can sell power for. That's your revenue stream. The Chinese government strictly regulates these prices. Why? They're trying to keep tight control on a lot of the metrics, for the main metrics for the economy, inflation, GDP growth, et cetera. And frankly, there's probably not the political tolerance for the population to start paying market electricity prices. They've got a program called Power for All or Power for Free. They're in fact giving away something like, I think it's free power to 4 million people a year. So clearly, This is not a market-based system, and this end of the sort of energy system is not responsive to what's happening in the market. That's a problem, because the coal market is becoming liberalized, right? And what you see here, so we can equate the two, is cost in terms of dollars per megawatt hour. The gap between these two lines is what you make if you're a Chinese power generator selling this power. It's not literal, we're excluding other costs, but coal is really the biggest cost, so this should give you an indicative idea. What's happened in the last year in the Chinese market is coal prices in China, for some domestic reasons, some international, pretty much followed the international energy trends straight up. And here you see that trend. What does that mean? It means the power companies start losing a lot of money. In fact, a lot of them start shutting down. The formula is fundamentally unsustainable. And so what happens? The government has to step in, because these two sort of different stages of reform in these two industries don't sync up when prices start to come in these directions. So what happened last summer? We got a liberalized coal market. Here we go. Chinese power generators are upset. The government steps in and caps coal prices. The Chinese government's power to do that, arguably, is not very good because the coal market in China is so decentralized. So what happens? Coal prices keep going up. So they try and raise power prices by a tiny bit. Doesn't do much. They have to step in again. Again, doesn't have the impact they want. They try again on the power prices. The Chinese power producers are screaming louder and louder. The system is essentially falling apart. And then the Chinese start to tweak the import-export policy. And this is the kind of thing that really impacts global markets, and what India pays for coal, and in a large way, what Europe pays for coal, because these things all trickle back in a global market to a lot of these other countries that are importing coal. So if you're paying attention to the global market, you've got to pay attention to these kind of issues and these reform processes within China. So what the Chinese did was they said, nobody's exporting any more coal. We're burning it at home. That obviously caused some panic in the global market. People expected that coal to be there in Asia, and it wasn't. So the point I'm getting at here is, before you start to understand emissions in China, or the systems that generate all the emissions, you've got to start to understand the state of the industries there and how they behave, and what kind of role the government's going to play in these markets. That's something we do a lot of in the program on energy and sustainable development. Lastly, I just want to touch on a few points. We've hit on some major themes in the West, touched a little bit on what's going on in China, left out a lot of really other interesting things going on in the coal market in places like South Africa and Indonesia and India and South America. If you want to talk about that in greater detail, of course, I'd be happy to do that. But I just want to say a word about mitigation. For those of you who are interested in climate, that might be the big question that you're interested in. Okay, these coal markets are volatile, they're connected. Right now, what's the state of mitigation? What's the state of our options? So I'll let you guess what's going to come next. It's not quite the Cohen brothers. I don't know if many of you saw that ad. It's not quite the coal industry either. I'll try and give you what I think is a pretty sober appraisal of the state of clean coal. Make of that what you will. I'll give you a second. That is the only project with a fully integrated carbon capture and storage process operating in the world. It's a Vattenfall project in Germany. It's 30 megawatts. It's a pilot project. It's by no means commercial. It is, however, real. This picture is taken at night. I think metaphorically it's appropriate. It's sort of obscured and dark, and we don't know what the hell's going on. So it is real. And, both in the US and Europe and so on, these types of projects are going to really get rolled out in the next 5 to 10 years. A lot of people have different ideas about what they cost, whether we can do it. I tend to think CCS is kind of like religion. You either believe or you don't. And I think we'll see what happens in the next 5 or 10 years. But, the reality is probably somewhere in between what you hear from the Cohen brothers and the coal industry. But worth keeping in mind, it's incredibly expensive. And in the near term, it's probably not going to happen without a lot of subsidies. I think McKinsey said that if we got 80 to 120 demo projects in Europe by 2030, you could get CCS done in Europe for somewhere between 30 to 45 euros. That's anybody's guess. There are a lot of assumptions that go into that, and it remains to be seen. So coming back to Asia, that's nice. That's in Europe. They can pay for it. They've got a whole scheme set up where they're going to sell carbon credits and cycle that money back into carbon storage. That's wonderful, but obviously China doesn't have a carbon price. So what's going on in China? This is China's big demo project. It's called Green Gen. The idea is to get to 400 megawatts and capture carbon and sequester it underground. That project is not under construction yet, although it has been fully planned. So I would say that in the next few decades, we're really not looking at clean coal to touch the 81% number we saw a few slides ago. And I think two issues that I think are big questions if we think about clean coal in China are, where's the CO2 going to go? I'm not aware of any really coherent idea of where it goes beyond sort of the limited amount of enhanced oil recovery capacity that exists in China, which is where a lot of this technology originated in Texas. And who's going to pay for it? I don't think the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism in the Kyoto, at 10 euros a ton is going to pay for clean coal. So if we want to pay for it in China, the existing international agreements are probably not going to get the job done, and we're going to have to rethink the type of wealth transfer that we're going to be involved in if we want to get this done in China, and we assume that they're really not going to do it at scale with their own resources. Maybe that's not a fair assumption. It's certainly an interesting subject to debate. So if we don't have CCS in the near term, well, hopefully in the long term, what are we really looking at in terms of mitigation for coal? I would suggest to you that the environmental movement ought to be really concerned with this graph that you see here. It's good old efficiency. China's at about 30% average efficiency right now. If you could get them to the average efficiency of the EU with existing technology that we've tested, we know how to deploy, it's working all over the world. In fact, some of the European plants are at 45%. That's meaningful reductions in the near term. I think it's counterintuitive for the environmental movement to think about paying for coal plants. But although I'll just throw it out there for debate, it's hard to see what else you're going to do besides invest in efficiency in some of these countries where it seems like the growth in coal demand is essentially inevitable, and the development that they prioritize is predicated on coal. So we'll sort of wrap it up and leave some time for questions. A few pretty broad conclusions that I think we can take away when we're looking at the global market in the sort of biggest macro sense. I think there's going to be massive growth in coal demand in the next 2 decades. It's mostly going to come from Asia. I would argue that is pretty close to inevitable. It's a reality, and we have to think about how we want to deal with it from an environmental perspective. Cap and trade is going to have some impact in the near term in the West in terms of what fuels get used and don't. How strong the price is relative to things like the difference between coal and gas makes a big impact. Thinking about what the price is going to be in the U.S., you got to wonder where the votes are in Congress and what type of tolerance they have for strong prices. Again, a lot of Asian development is predicated on coal. Hard to see how that's going to change. So if we want to get serious about mitigation opportunities, really need to understand these markets, what's driving them, how the institutions that may have leverage over these markets, like the Chinese government or the EU or the UN, are going to behave, how they're going to affect these markets, and how these markets are going to grow compared to other energy markets. When we start to really understand that, then maybe we can think about picking out leverage points. That's essentially where I was going to go today. Got some more details and slides if we want to get into more detail, but thank you very much.
Okay, questions, fantastic.
Say some more about the Berlin model, please.
Could you elaborate on what you're referring to?
Did you say that you're cooperating with?
Oh, I'm sorry, the Berlin model.
Berlin
Yes.
model, yeah. I'm just
Sure,
curious to
sure,
know
sure.
how big, complicated, user-friendly, available, how's it doing on predicting the past, et cetera?
So that's where we are right now, is sort of aligning the model with previous market conditions and making sure that it can sort of replicate what happened in the actual market. The next stage will be when that logic is pinned down and the model behaves in ways that we think are consistent with the way the market behaves, extending that out to 2030 and maybe 2040. The major outputs of that model are going to be coal consumption inside of countries. We're going to have regional breakdowns in places like China that'll give us some idea of internal domestic flows within countries. And then the major output is going to be global trade flows, where the coal comes from, where it goes, how much it costs, and how that market is going to evolve over time. The group doing it is called DIW Berlin. It's the German Institute for Economic Research. They've done a lot of work in the past similar to this on natural gas markets. And so thankfully they're leveraging some of that expertise going forward. It's a static equilibrium model, or it will be dynamic.
Okay, a couple of questions. What's the average size of coal plants being built around the world? And could you speak about the potential for trigen coal plants instead of just larger, more efficient plants?
So, I mean, it's hard to sort of say the average number around the world. If you look at somewhere like India, stuff they're looking at right now is 1,600 megawatts. In the US, the stuff that's getting built is anywhere from 300 to 1,000. So I think it's hard to really say without taking into account issues around regional policy. The Chinese are undertaking a major consolidation move around 13 production bases. So what they want to do is minimize cost of transporting coal from a mine to a power plant and put a whole bunch of massive power plants basically on the mine site. So they recently sort of planned what they call 13 major coal bases, and they're going to couple massive power plants right next to the mine site in that case. So it's hard to, I think it's better to think about it, or I think more useful in regional terms, because it's so affected by institutions and policy and regulation. To answer your first question, and the second question was around trigen. Yeah. So I'm not familiar with that technology to a great degree.
Use the heat to provide cooling and heating services in addition to electricity?
Yeah, I mean, I think recycling waste heat is something that the generation community is always looking to do. And as far as that makes sense in certain countries it doesn't. Or to the extent you can get it done and make money doing it, in certain places, I mean, hopefully it'll get done.
Just two quick questions. One, how many coal miners are there actually in the US? So how much would that affect the US litigation must be brought in? Second question is, how long, at the estimate of the growth of the coal market at the moment, how long could coal reserves using today's technology actually last?
So those pretty interesting questions. I think the first question you asked to me is directly related to the debate around green jobs, right? The argument that you're seeing out of a lot of the think tanks on the right in DC right now to counteract the sort of green job agenda, mostly coming out of the Center for American Progress, is, well, if you put a tax on coal or if you put a price of CO2, you're not creating new jobs in the wind farm, on a net basis, because you're killing coal jobs and gas jobs and oil jobs. So I think these numbers will be relevant in the political debate going forward. And the number in the U.S. is about 107,000 coal miners right now. It's a pretty substantial bit of employment. And what was your second question again? It was about?
Just wondering how long coal reserves are estimated to last, given the growth rates projected in the developing world using today's technologies.
So instead of giving you a number, I'm going to say this. The knowledge around reserves is really poor. And I'm not going to give you a number. I'm going to tell you that in the next 10 to 20 years, you can expect major jumps in the official numbers coming out of countries and places that track this, including the IEA, the World Energy Council, and so on. Conversations I've had with people in the U.S. Indicate that the U.S. numbers that you see in the EIA are based on data from the 1950s and at the most recent, the 1970s. They're undertaking a major revision of the reserves estimates in the U.S. right now. I anticipate that the numbers that are deemed to be economically recoverable at current prices, which is what we care about when we talk about reserves, is going to come way down in the U.S. On the other hand, you've got places like Indonesia where you may have 50 billion tons of coal under the jungle. Nobody knows. So rather than give you a number, I would suggest that reserves is not a real constraint on coal consumption in any point in the near future that I can see. And in fact, what I do see is major jumps in those reserve numbers as people re-explore old reserves and add new reserves into the economically recoverable category.
Yeah, I wanted to comment a little bit on one of your conclusions, which is you were saying at the pricing for carbon caps, the impact of how gas as an alternative fuel prices would have to change more dramatically to get people to change their coal choices. There are many other costs. There are environmental costs of mountaintop removal and health effects and all kinds of other costs. And I think, would you like to expand on your conclusion and say, well, how would we have to recover or burden some of these environmental costs, which currently are not attributed directly to the coal, to make the carbon tax at the level that's being proposed now look like it would change people's behavior?
I think undeniably there's let's call it a social human externality to the coal problem. You see a lot of this debate in West Virginia where this guy Don Blankenship of Massey Energy is actually tied up in a Supreme Court case because he basically bought the judge in West Virginia so he could keep blowing things up and sending people to get black lung. And that's not a political comment, and I don't know the specifics of that case, so I don't. That's what I saw on CNN. But that is an issue. Our focus really is more on the sort of downstream side in terms of how these issues play out in the energy markets. So I think it's definitely a worthwhile debate about how you incorporate those costs that are very real for a lot of people working in the coal business into choices we make about what fuels we use. But that, for us, is not the real focus of our work and the type of analytics we do in the energy market.
The $14 carbon price is not really switch to any changes in global production. Is that just going to pass forward the incidence as higher costs for consumers when the policy is enacted? So in the end, it just becomes basically an end-use tax. And so what we're doing is trying to discourage demand. Is that how you look at it?
Let me make a distinction. I don't want to make the claim that a carbon price is not going to affect, or $14 is not going to affect what fuels get used. It absolutely will. And it starts absolutely to change the incentives around choices people make about energy consumption. That's without a doubt. I'm talking about...
But why is that? Why should it affect the mode of production given the numbers that you showed us?
Depends on the industry. So the numbers that I showed you are based on sort of average efficiencies in a certain power grid. If you think about the margin, right? If you think about, to take the case that I showed, which was sort of the average efficiency of gas versus the average efficiency of coal, right? That's sort of where you are. But if you think about really efficient gas plants against really old coal plants, $14 might start doing the trick.
We have a lot of old coal plants in the U.S. that are probably at the point they need to be replaced. How do you think that will play out within what you're looking at?
Well, that's a big question. In fact, maybe one of the biggest questions in the U.S. right now. As I sort of indicated, the utility industry has lately been more or less paralyzed, not because of anything going on in their own business, but because of the regulatory and policy climate. Again, we're talking about investments that have to pay off over a 50-year time frame. And to the extent in the gas market or the oil market, you can do a project and you can lock in the economics out to 2020 or 2025. You can't do that in the coal market right now, primarily because of the carbon piece, and we don't know what that market's going to look like, and there really aren't financial opportunities to hedge yourself against the sort of coming volatility. So that's one issue, is that we don't know what those markets are going to look like. So you can't have any certainty around the economics about whether you're going to be paying $14 or $50 and how fast the ramp up's going to be. The second issue, and I think right now, more importantly, is the regulatory issue. The permitting process and the battle around the permitting process and whether or not you apply standards from the Clean Air Act to CO2 emissions from coal-powered plants in the U.S. is really one to watch. The Sierra Club won a major legal battle there at the end of last year in about October. Stephen Johnson under Bush's EPA came in and said, no way. Reversed it. Lisa Jackson now has signaled she's going to reevaluate that. I think you could interpret that signal to mean that they're considering changing it, given the politics in Washington right now, but I can't answer that question definitively. So I think certainly there's an element to the price risk and not knowing what that is, what the exposure to carbon is, as somebody who's burning coal and waiting for the CO2 policy to land in a real way that you can start betting money on. We're talking billions of dollars. And I think we should make a distinction between that risk and the regulatory risk. And what's happening in the EPA right now and how they interpret Massachusetts versus EPA, which is that decision around whether CO2 is a pollutant, and how that gets translated to regulation in the permitting process for coal plants, and what type of cost that adds to coal plants is something to really watch.
One last question.
Yeah. Could you comment on how you tie efficiency of production of electricity into the comparison of the spark and dark price curves?
So those numbers are based on average efficiencies in the German market. So I don't remember the exact number, but I think coal's at about close to the European average in those numbers, about 38%. I think gas is closer to 48%. So I can get that for you for sure, but it's based on the average numbers in the German market, and if I recall correctly, that's about where they are.
Very good. Maybe we should wrap it up with that, and thank our speaker once again.